Well, thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for that kind introduction. It's truly an honor for me to be here at this magnificent Hall of Philosophy. I'd like to especially thank Rafia Khadir, who extended the invitation, Melissa Spas, and the entire religion team for putting together such a wonderful program in week 4. To Disti and Tom at the Hall of Missions for their kind hospitality. I wish you could join us in the mornings for our breakfast conversations with Bishop Eugene and this week's Pastor Layla and the scholars staying in the house. Of all the incredible programs happening across Chautauqua, the lectures, garden and lake tours, Palestine Walk, I am looking forward to nothing more than tomorrow morning's breakfast. On July 11th, the United Nations of this year released an updated projection for the global population in the year 2100, with 3 scenarios of varying certainty. Less probable projections vary from a high of 14 billion people, almost double of what we have now by the year 2100, to a low of 6.5 billion people, so a drop in the population from today. High probable projections have us adding about another 2 billion people, going from 8 billion people today to about 10 billion, the number that Dr. Jennifer Shuba shared with us in her wonderful lecture yesterday, so 10 billion. These new 2 billion people will mostly be added in what we call the global south. Without migrants, the populations of the more developed nations, including the United States, will otherwise decline. Overall, the world is getting older. People over the age of 65 will outnumber those under 18. In fact, the population in 63 countries has already peaked. One 2019 study published in 2019, it argues that over the course of the next 200 years, the following 13 European countries will be majority Muslim, crossing the threshold in this order: Cyprus, 2085. Sweden, 2125. France and Greece at the same time, 2135. Belgium, 2140. Bulgaria, in the same year. Italy and Luxembourg, 2175. The UK, 2180. Slovenia, 2190. Switzerland, 2195. Ireland, 2200. And Lithuania in 2215. The transition will at times be bumpy, concludes the paper, but ultimately it will change the face of Europe socially, politically, and economically. We will hear the call for prayer from loudspeakers in more and more neighborhoods, as you hear the symphony and the bells here in Chautauqua. The rhythms of work and school life may adjust to accommodate Friday prayer and Ramadan. Halal food will be normalized in stores and restaurants. Foreign policies will shift to favor nations where migrants have close ties. These social, political, economic changes, the paper concludes, and I quote from their conclusion, will bring periods of adjustment that would be painful for the European society. Some talk of shock of civilizations, and will depend on the degree of openness and tolerance of the communities toward each other and their willingness to build a balanced European society enriched with a diversity of beliefs and cultures. End quote. So this reminds me of a joke. You know, after 9/11, there was a proliferation of Muslim comedians. They even had an Axis of Evil comedy tour. And one of the guys, he branded himself as "Allah made me funny." And he has, in one of his segments, he has, he paints a scene of walking into a mosque. And in every mosque that you go, there's an uncle there who wants to explain everything to a non-Muslim who walks in. So he calls him, "Uncle, let me explain you. Let me explain you what's happening." And so he's boasting about all kinds of things that he's proud of. And then when he says, "Bob," he calls him Bob. "Bob, let me tell you, there are 7 million Muslims in America." And then he goes into his comedian voice and he says, "Bob is not impressed. He's scared." All right, jokes aside, let me offer a few examples to put your minds at ease. This very camp is an indication that things won't be all that bad if this history moves in the way that they're projecting. I stand before you as a Muslim American. One of the first persons I ran into at Chautauqua was a Muslim whose family has been tied to Chautauqua for 60 years. One of the speakers at this very forum in the Hall of Philosophy just yesterday was a Muslim, Imam Majid, of Sudanese origin. My talk was organized by the religion team whose director of programs wears a headscarf. I just learned that she was married in the mosque of the Arabic-Islamic College in Chicago, where I currently serve as visiting vice president for academic affairs, as a living bridge to the proudly Catholic University of Notre Dame. Go Irish! They don't have a slogan yet. The land on which another Chicago area mosque stands, Masjid al-Fatir in Hyde Park, was donated by the one and only Muhammad Ali, who floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. Islam is here, and it's been here for a while. To learn more about some of this history, take a look at, there's a lot you can read, but I'll just mention a couple of things. Amir Hussein's little book, Muslims and the Making of America. Or you can watch The Great Muslim American Road Trip. It's a documentary produced by UPF that aired on PBS. So we're already here, and it's not so bad, is it? Oh, thank you. Thank you. The best is yet to come. Sharia laws in November. No. That election has other problems. We'll wait a little bit. Why do people migrate? Some of us, like me, do so voluntarily for better lives. Muhammad Ali was the descendant of African slaves brought here in chains. Some migrate because they are priced out of neighborhoods. Gentrification, as we discussed at this morning's breakfast. The deluge at our southern border is due to a mix of drivers: political persecution, lack of economic opportunities. People migrate because of war and increasingly climate change. According to migration policy, there were 33 million natural disaster-related displacements in the year 2022. Most migration is internal, within the borders of a nation, whether it's floods in Pakistan or drought in Somalia or war in Syria. Even here in the US, and they have a climate explainer, 3.2 million US adults were displaced or evacuated due to natural disasters in 2022, of whom more than 500,000 had not returned by the beginning of 2023. Worst case scenarios are projecting the displacement of hundreds of millions of people in the coming decades. Some are predicting an all-out collapse of the global population, brought on by sudden and drastic shocks to the global system. Remember COVID-19, when supply chains broke down? The one New York Times headline said, "The floating traffic jam that freaked us all out." Now imagine something like that on multiple orders of magnitude. Vanessa Machado de Oliveira begins her book titled Hospicing Modernity with a frightening picture of the world, as she imagines what it would be like on the 100th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm going to quote this from her book. She painted this scenario. They were invited for a conference in Germany, and so she recreates it in the book. Imagine today is December 10th, 2048, and you are participating in a 3D virtual reality world conference call aimed at deciding how we should educate our children and ourselves after the devastating impact of the events of the past 30 years. These events were caused by human greed, arrogance, stubbornness, and an unwillingness to learn from our wrongs, failures, and mistakes. There are 1 billion people on this call. There are 1 billion people on this call, a third of today's total world population. We will start by recalling significant events that happened in the last 3 decades. What you will see next is just the text of this presentation. The associated images and videos are now being transferred to your body implants. Please blink twice to accept the files. And that's the end of the quote. So if your mind flickers, as you hear this, mine did too. I mean, what? 3 billion people in 2048, blink twice to accept files. So Machado de Oliveira blends collapse with progress. So the two things are juxtaposed into a convoluted, but not entirely implausible vision of one possible future. In Teaching at Twilight, the Meaning of Education in the Age of Collapse, the title of his book. A friend of mine and colleague Ahmed Afzal, he argues that the Malthusian trap has not been evaded. It has only been delayed. There are limits to growth on a finite planet. Technological innovations, he argues, allows us to increase our planet's carrying capacity, but only at the expense of other life forms. A tipping point is coming. Afzal relies on conclusions offered by the Planetary Boundaries Framework, curated by the Stockholm Resilience Center, according to which we are in a condition known as overshoot. After critical thresholds are crossed, the Earth is likely to experience a phase shift, a catastrophic chain reaction that could ultimately render the climate incompatible with life. Under this scenario, if sufficient numbers of humans happen to survive, the population will be numbered in the hundreds of millions, not in the tens of billions. All right, so I'm going to switch gears. The threat of climate change, this is not a climate change talk, I'm setting up the religion, like how we think about the future of religion. So though the threat of climate change is existential, it is not the only threat. The doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, reads 90 seconds to midnight. And so, says Pope Francis, step by step, I'm quoting from him, we are moving towards catastrophe. Piece by piece, the world risks becoming the theater of a unique third world war. So if you think this is all somewhat far-fetched, how about a more rational source than the Pope? Maybe the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. This is what he says. Like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, humanity is having an outsized impact on our planet. In the case of the climate crisis, we are not the dinosaurs. We are the meteor. We are not only in danger, we are the danger. All right, so that was Antonio Guterres. How do we think about all this? What does this have to do with religion? If we think of population growth in conventional terms, with presumptions of continuity, perhaps there'll be some wars, some climate disruptions on the horizon, but really no collapse, then we can offer one set of predictions. And in this set, nones, N-O-N-E-S, or the unaffiliated, will be competing with Hinduism for the third place behind Christianity and Islam in adherence of world religions. Their sharpest increase being in the more developed nations. Nones describe themselves as, quote, atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular. According to a recent Pew study, 63% of them actually believe in God, or at least they don't necessarily reject God. They're just not religious and tend to question a lot of religious teachings. Like Europe, the United States is expected to experience a dramatic change in its religious landscape. According to another Pew study, depending on whether religious switching continues, so I'm actually quoting from the study, depending on whether religious switching continues at recent rates, so these predictions, have variables and assumptions built into them, speeds up or stops entirely, the projections show Christians of all ages shrinking from 64% to between a little more than a half and just above 1/3 in this nation by 2070. Over the same period, nones would rise from the current 30% to somewhere between 34 and 52% of the US population. These trends are obviously alarming for Christian nationalists who believe that America is America because America is Christian. The election is on November 5th, by the way. I'm just saying, this is not a, you can vote either way. Now, instead of continuity, what if the future has in store for us a rupture, a collapse? In that case, all bets are off. You may have heard the phrase, there are no atheists in foxholes. Existential threats nudge us closer to God. This theory now has empirical grounding. Between 2009 and 2011, Christchurch, New Zealand experienced a devastating earthquake and a series of aftershocks just as a nationwide study on religious attitudes was underway. The study found an uptick in religiosity in areas that were afflicted by the tremors. What explains this phenomenon? I think it has to do with our sense of control. This is why the Prophet Muhammad, the prophet in the Islamic tradition, especially cherished the faith that youth have. If you have faith in your youth, when you're young, it's a time when there's a tendency to feel invincible. So the modern world is like a confident teenager. We think we have it all figured out. We will live forever. Maybe our civilization will. Nobody can take us down. Bring it on. The historian Yuval Noah Harari, I really enjoy reading him, but he personifies this sensibility in Homo Deus. I don't know if you've read Homo Deus, his second book, after Sapiens. A Brief History of Tomorrow. He writes audaciously about what he calls the new human agenda. Now that we have more or less solved the problems of hunger, plague, and war. He wrote this before COVID-19, by the way, before Russia, Ukraine, before Israel and Gaza, and hopefully we won't add China, Taiwan to the list, I pray. Of course, these problems have not been completely solved, he admits. I'm going to be fair to him. And quote, but, this is what he says, they have been transformed from incomprehensible, and I think he has a point. They have been transformed from incomprehensible and uncontrollable forces of nature into manageable challenges. We don't need to pray to any god or saint to rescue us from them. Make a vaccine. So Harari goes on to argue in the book that even death is becoming like a technical problem that we are trying to solve. What if we find a gene that solves the problem of aging? Why do you think we won't? Shouldn't this be on the human agenda? Enter Homo Deus, the immortal beings we were always meant to be. Not immortal, so you still have an accident. And so there's all kinds of implications, right, on anxieties. Christian Smith defines religion as culturally prescribed practices. So he's a sociologist. The practices designed to create an alignment with superhuman powers in the hopes of realizing goods and avoiding things bad. Religiosity is, according to this approach, tied to feelings of dependence. The more we gain power over nature, the less our need for the superhuman to help us attain the goods we seek. Think of how quickly this feeling of dependence comes when we experience despair. You are on an airplane. It happens to me all the time. And it takes a sudden, sharp dive. For a second, you think this could be it. You hear your next heartbeat in your ear and in your throat. Unless you're someone like Christopher Hitchens, one of the 4 horsemen of atheism, at that moment, you remember God. Let me give you 2 illustrations of this idea. One from pop culture and the second from scripture. So how many of you have you seen the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock? A number of you. All right, so I'm just going to go through that and illustrate this point. They're on a routine spacewalk. Everything is fine. This is modernity. Advanced, in control, scientific. Astronauts exploring new frontiers, solving problems. Now, in this scenario, a presumption of continuity prevails. Soon, they will safely re-enter the atmosphere in their spacecraft and go home. So, obviously, it's a movie. That's not what happens. Suddenly, a Russian missile strike destroys a satellite. So we can talk about how the CIA and DOD influence Hollywood plots in another talk. That's how it happens. A Russian missile strike destroys a satellite, setting off a chain reaction. The debris kills everyone except Sandra Bullock. She's spinning around in space, totally disoriented, no control. This is collapse. And it happens suddenly, and all bets are off. So, spoiler alert. Sorry to those who thought they wanted to watch this film now. I'm going to have to do it because it's important to my talk. She finds religion. It's a very subtle scene in the film, but go back and see if you can find it. The Quran offers this kind of intuitive reasoning as an argument for God. The Quran gives different arguments, but one of this is this kind. In the chapter on Jonah, who was swallowed by the whale, Yunus, it's Surah number 10, verse number 22, and I quote, "It is He, that is God, who enables you to travel on land and sea until when you are sailing on ships and rejoicing in the favoring wind, a storm arrives. Waves come at those on board from all sides, engulfing them, and they feel like there is no escape. Then they pray to God, professing sincere devotion to Him. That's the verse. So the future of religion is going to depend in part, I would say in very large part, on whether the seas of civilization, of global civilization, are calm, more or less, or stormy. I, for one, don't think we are in any position to make reasonable predictions. We can't even predict 100% if it will be Trump and Biden in November. I wrote this line hours before the attempt on Trump's life on Saturday. The theme of week 2 at Chautauqua this summer was AI. You know the danger. The speaker mentioned it in his talk this morning. We stand at the threshold of a major paradigm shift one way or another. Presumptions of continuity may no longer hold. In the words of Pope Francis, because I am, after all, at Notre Dame, but even if I weren't at Notre Dame, I think I would quote the Pope on this one. We are not living in an era of change, but a change of era. Scholars of big history identify several threshold moments: the Big Bang, the formation of the first stars, supernovas that created more complex elements, life, and humans. Now, humans went through thresholds into agriculture and industry, and now technology and communication and biotechnology. And now we are at another threshold is upon us. Nobody knows what lies on the other side of, again, the Pope used this term, a cognitive industrial revolution. One scholar of traditional Islam says that sentient AI will be the beast that rises from the earth, as foretold in the book of Revelations. And he says this because silicon is sand after all, it's earth. Mustafa Suleyman, co-founder of DeepMind and current head of Microsoft AI, begins his book, The Coming Wave, by arguing that containment, and his cover, it's hard to read at first in the title, because he takes the AI out of containment and puts it up. He's like, containment is not possible. AI has been climbing the ladder of cognitive abilities for decades, he writes. And now it now looks set to reach human-level performance across a very wide range of tasks within the next 3 years. It's already doing it. It was already doing it on certain tasks. I think recently it passed Google's test to be hired as a coding engineer with a salary, ChatGPT did, at a salary of $183,000 or something. And there are so many interesting scenarios he paints in this book on what's coming. He knows it because he sees it, he's building it. Think of the difference between humans and AI. This is how I think of it. Like the difference between ape and man. What will religion look like in such a world? So Religion 101 says beliefs and practices vary in different contexts. Religions are internally diverse and they're constantly changing and evolving. Robert Bellah offers 3 stages in the development of religion, drawing on earlier scholarship in human evolution. So ritual, myth, and theory, or philosophy. Myth is the story side of religion. Take the story of Adam and Eve. What does it mean? The garden, the tree, the serpent, the fall. In Judaism, the story is about exile. Its resolution, return, by following God's commandments, covenanted through Abraham. In Christianity, the story is about original sin. Its resolution, atonement, through faith in Jesus Christ. In Islam, the story is one of disobedience. Its resolution, submission to God by obedience to God's messengers. In Braiding Sweetgrass. Now, there's a Potawatomi author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She shares a different kind of story. And I know many of you are familiar with her, and you have read the book because it was the 2022 Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle selection in week 2 of that year. In the beginning, there was Sky World. That's how the story begins. And I'm paraphrasing parts of it. So I'm going to read a little from her book. But it's not a direct quote because I've paraphrased in the interest of time. I wanted to read just maybe her book for this talk. Sky Woman fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze, clutching a bundle tightly in her hand, soil and seed. The geese rose together from the water. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Resting on their wings, she saw a council gather. Loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of this shell. Loon dove first to bring mud from the water, which they presumed she needed. But the distance was too far. One by one, the other animals offered to help. Otter, beaver, sturgeon, but the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. Eventually, the little muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He was gone a very long time. He surfaced lifeless. But in his tightly clenched paw was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back." Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on the turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Many come to live with her on Turtle Island. So that's my paraphrase with some lines picked directly from her, but I cut it short. Kimmerer compares this story to the one we are more familiar with, the one that has made our civilization. And so I want to make this, I'm going to read from her one more time to draw our attention to the comparison. On the one side of the world were people whose relationship with the living world was shaped by Sky Woman, who created a garden for the well-being of all. On the other side was another woman with a garden and a tree. But for tasting its fruit, she was banished from the garden, and the gates clanged shut behind her. That mother of men was to wander in the wilderness and earn her bread by the sweat of her brow, not by filling her mouth with the sweet, juicy fruits that bend the branches low. Same species, same earth, different stories. Like creation stories everywhere, cosmologies are a source of identity and orientation to the world. They tell us who we are. One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world, the other to banishment. I end the quote here. That's the last I read of her. So what is she telling us? Now this is critical to the Abrahamic faiths. I want to remind you that it's also a critique of Islam. But I read it with great interest. So what is she telling us? Do these kinds of origin stories really make us who we are? Like mythology, science also tells stories. This is where I want to move towards where I end. Comparative methodologist Joseph Campbell has written extensively about the impact of science on myth. So I'm going to read now just a section from his book, The Myths We Live By. It's the first chapter. I was sitting the other day, this is Campbell narrating this. This was published in 1972. I was sitting the other day at a lunch counter that I particularly enjoy when a youngster about 12 years old, arriving with his school satchel, took the place at my left. Beside him came a younger little man holding the hand of his mother, and those two took the next seats. All gave their orders, and while waiting, the boy at my side said, turning his head slightly to the mother, Jimmy wrote a paper today on the evolution of man, and teacher said he was wrong, that Adam and Eve were our first parents. My Lord, I thought, what a teacher. This is Campbell. The lady 3 seats away then said, well, teacher was right. Our first parents were Adam and Eve. What a mother for a 20th century child. The youngster responded, yes, I know. But this was a scientific paper. And for that, this is Campbell narrating, I was ready to recommend him for a Distinguished Service Medal from the Smithsonian Institution. The mother, however, came back with another. Oh, those scientists, she said angrily, those are only theories. And he was up to that one too. Yes, I know, was his cool and calm reply, but they have been factualized. They found the bones. That's the end of the Campbell. So new philosophies, worldviews, and cosmologies invite new readings of old stories, reshaping our sense of the sacred. Science today offers its own creation story. Like the original peoples of the Great Lakes region did once upon a time, like the peoples of the Vedas have done for millennia, and the Abrahamic peoples have in the Bible and the Quran. In the beginning was the Big Bang. But like in Hinduism, science can also have more than one creation story. In the beginning was the quantum flux. In the beginning was the multiverse. Scott Appleby's definition of religion is that it is the human response to a reality perceived as sacred. Earthquakes and floods were once understood through the lens of the sacred. God's punishment on the wicked. Now it's about tectonic plates and the hydrologic cycle and humanitarian relief. This is how religions evolve. Tradition, as explained to us by the likes of Alasdair MacIntyre, is an argument extended through time historically. It makes things new while maintaining continuity with the past. The word tradition incorporates the meaning of betrayal, because in making things new, even with the best of intentions, is ultimately an act of betrayal. In God is Not One, scholar of religion Stephen Prothero argues against the thesis that all religions are different paths that converge on the summit of the same mountain. Our speaker yesterday, Pastor Bob, made this same point. Prothero classifies religions into 3 broad categories based on the fundamental human problem they identify and the solution they propose to solve it. There are religions of release. Their problem is suffering or being trapped in cycles of rebirth, from which they seek release through moksha or nirvana, like Hinduism and Buddhism. Then there are religions of repair. Their problem is sin, disobedience, and exile, for which they seek repair through atonement, submission, and return. The Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are religions of repair. And then there are religions of reversion, whose problem is social chaos, ugliness, disequilibrium. Their solution is to go back to a time of social harmony, of beauty, and of balance. Examples of religions of reversion are Confucianism and the Navajo religion. This is Prothero's typology. I find this problem solution framework to be quite helpful in not only thinking about world religions today, but also into the future. Regardless of how our sense of the sacred shifts with new knowledge, some of us will continue to seek release out of this cycle. Others will continue to repair what they think is broken. And others still will seek to revert to a time when all things were in harmony. To be sure, all religions incorporate each of these problems and solutions. It's a matter of emphasis and what's primary. So Prothero tells us one more thing. You can tell what someone's true religion is based on their primary story. Change the story, change the religion. I want to connect this insight into what Homi Kharas said in his lecture on the middle class this morning. Gen Z across the world not only represents a global middle class that's growing, they also share a story that's inflected with a shared story of the cosmos, with shared problems of a global consumption economy that's out of control. Religions of the future, in all their glorious diversity, will succeed or fail to the extent that their traditions are capable of adapting to an unpredictable and ever-evolving human predicament, guided by stories that speak to us today. So to conclude, is that a good time? In 2022, Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew wrote the foreword to a volume on ethics in action for sustainable development. One of the lead editors was Jeffrey Sachs, which examines the role that the world's religions, philosophies from East and West, and indigenous and secular traditions can play to advance the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals agenda. They, in my view, are taking religion in the right direction. The SDGs call for a moral economy in which fair distribution and sustainability are prioritized over efficiency and profits. A society in which the dignity of labor, forgiveness from crushing debts, I think you can see this in our religious value systems, and time for leisure and spiritual growth are privileged over spendthrift economic pursuits. A planet in which our kindred species and the air and water that sustain life are protected from exploitation or extinction. A humanitarian agenda that seeks to provide all people with basic needs, eliminate extreme poverty, uplift the socially marginalized, and save the planet's life-giving biodiversity and ecosystems is a solid framework for interreligious engagement. The SDG agenda is value-laden. It combines science and spirit, ethics and governance. Remarkably, every single one of the world's 193 countries signed on to this agenda in 2015. It's an agenda for 2030. We're not going to make it. We're mired in great power rivalry and global competition. Trillions for wars, crumbs for humanity. One of my colleagues, David Courtwright, he writes on how budgets are allocated, and he says budgets are moral documents. Can religions help us do better? Cooperation for the implementation of the SDGs relies on what Chris Seipel and Dennis Hoover call the collaborative capacity of covenantal pluralism. Encounter is powerful medicine against xenophobia. By working together in relationship, religious actors learn to constructively influence the public square with their values while appreciating what others bring to the table. It's a multi-faith engagement in the public square. What better mode of encounter could there be? You shall know them by their fruits. Each community has its own direction to which it turns, proclaims the Quran. And I quote, "Race with each other to do good deeds. And wherever you are, God will bring you together. God has the power to do everything." Thank you very much.